What if I told you that Carl Jung, one of history's most brilliant psychologists, identified 6 specific types of people who could completely derail your psychological growth and personal development? These aren't just difficult personalities we occasionally encounter. These are psychological patterns so toxic, so destructive to human consciousness, that Jung considered them genuine threats to individuation itself. We're diving deep into Jung's analytical psychology to understand these 6 dangerous personality types. More importantly, we'll explore how recognizing these patterns can protect your mental energy, preserve your psychological boundaries, and safeguard your journey toward authentic selfhood. But here's what makes this exploration truly profound. Jung understood that the greatest danger doesn't come from external threats, it comes from our unconscious attraction to these very patterns. The people who can hurt us most are often those who exploit our deepest psychological vulnerabilities. So settle in, because this isn't just about avoiding toxic people. This is about understanding the shadow dynamics that govern human relationships and learning to protect the sacred space of your own consciousness. Type 1. The shadow projector. Let's begin with perhaps the most insidious of Jung's dangerous personalities, the shadow projector. Jung warned us that everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it becomes. Shadow projectors are individuals who have completely disowned their own darkness. Instead of facing their flaws, integrating their mistakes, or acknowledging their capacity for harm, they systematically dump all of this psychological material onto others through unconscious projection. Here's how they operate. They maintain an image of absolute perfection, righteousness, or moral superiority. But this inflated self-image comes at a devastating cost. Everything they refuse to acknowledge about themselves gets projected outward onto the people around them. Jung observed that when one tries desperately to be good and wonderful and perfect, then all the more the shadow develops a definite will to be black and evil and destructive. Shadow projectors become psychologically dangerous because they need others to carry their disowned material. Picture this scenario. You're in a relationship with someone who never takes responsibility for anything that goes wrong. When they make a mistake, it's because you distracted them. When they lose their temper, it's because you provoked them. When they feel insecure, it's because you're not supportive enough. This isn't just immaturity. This is systematic psychological manipulation through shadow projection. They've created a dynamic where you become the container for everything negative in their psyche. While they maintain their inflated self-image, Jung noted that those who rely too heavily on projection to shield them from their shadow go through life forever in need of scapegoats or people on whom to blame all their problems. They cannot exist without someone to make wrong, someone to carry their darkness. The warning signs are unmistakable. First, they display an inability to take genuine responsibility for personal flaws or mistakes. Second, they consistently see others in black and white terms, with themselves always in the white. Third, they become emotionally volatile when confronted with any evidence of their own shortcomings. But here's the deeper psychological trap. Shadow projectors often appear initially attractive because they seem so put together, so confident, so clear about right and wrong. They may even seem protective, always ready to defend you against others they perceive as flawed or dangerous. The toxicity reveals itself over time as you realize that you're living in a psychological prison, where you're responsible for everything negative while they claim credit for everything positive. This dynamic doesn't just drain your energy. It actively prevents you from developing authentic self-awareness because you're constantly managing their projections instead of exploring your own psyche. Jung's wisdom here is profound. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But shadow projectors reverse this completely. They use their irritation with others as evidence of others' failings, rather than opportunities for self-examination. Type 2. The individuation blocker, the second dangerous personality type Jung would recognize, is what we might call the individuation blocker. These are people who systematically prevent others from achieving psychological independence and authentic selfhood. Jung emphasized that self-determination propels individuation. But certain individuals create relationship dynamics that make this psychological development impossible. They operate through what Jung called participation mystique, a psychological fusion where the subject cannot clearly distinguish himself from the object, but is bound to it by a direct relationship that amounts to partial identity. Now, this might sound abstract, but the practical reality is devastating. Individuation blockers create what Jung termed psychological contamination. They violate others' psychological boundaries, making it impossible to maintain the sacred inner space necessary for psychological growth. Here's how they work. When you start developing interests they don't share, they make you feel guilty for being different. When you want to spend time alone for reflection or creativity, they interpret this as rejection or abandonment. When you begin to discover aspects of yourself that don't fit their image of who you should be, they subtly or overtly punish this authenticity. Jung observed that when we're undifferentiated, we become codependent. We can't or rarely access our innate, true self, and our thoughts and actions revolve around someone or something else. Individuation blockers actively foster this psychological dependency. They discourage personal development efforts, often through seemingly caring statements like, "Why do you need therapy when you have me?" Or, "I don't understand why you're always trying to change yourself." They create environments where your psychological growth feels like a betrayal of the relationship. The mechanism is insidious because it often masquerades as love or concern. They might say they just want to be close to you, that they don't want you to change because they love you just as you are. But Jung understood that healthy love supports individuation, not prevents it. When you are self-contained, psychologically independent, you don't look to another person for completion. But individuation blockers systematically undermine this independence. They need you to remain psychologically dependent because your growth threatens their control. Jung's warning was clear. One cannot individuate as long as one is playing a role to oneself. Individuation blockers force others into inauthentic roles, preventing the essential psychological separation needed for healthy development. The damage goes beyond just stunted personal growth. These relationships create what Jung called a violation of the principle of individuality. You lose touch with your authentic desires, your natural rhythms, your genuine responses to life. You become a performer in their psychological drama rather than the author of your own story. Recognizing an individuation blocker requires honest self-examination. Do you feel guilty for having interests or opinions that differ from theirs? Do you find yourself constantly explaining or justifying your need for personal space or growth? Do you feel like you're living someone else's version of your life? Jung understood that individuation is not possible without relationship, but it is not compatible with togetherness that erases individual boundaries. Healthy relationships support each person's journey toward wholeness. Toxic relationships demand the sacrifice of authentic selfhood for the illusion of connection. Type 3. The psychological vampire. Jung's understanding of what he called psychological parasitism anticipated our modern concept of energy vampires. These are individuals who systematically drain others' psychological energy through boundary violations and emotional manipulation. Jung described the mechanism through his concept of participation mystique. When a person complains that he is always on bad terms with his wife or the people he loves, you will see when you analyze this person that he has been living in participation mystique with those he loves. He has spread himself over other people until he has become identical with them, which is a violation of the principle of individuality. But psychological vampires take this dynamic even further. They don't just blur boundaries. They actively feed off others' energy while giving nothing authentic in return. They operate through chronic neediness without reciprocation, creating endless crises that demand others' psychological attention and care. Jung interpreted the vampire archetype as an unconscious complex that took over control over the psyche, like a curse or spell. Modern Jungian analysis reveals that psychological vampires easily become restless and abusive, unless new sources are feeding their self-esteem. They feel they have the right to control and possess others and to exploit them without guilt feelings. Here's what makes them so dangerous. They create what appears to be intimate connection, but it's actually psychological consumption. They share their problems, their fears, their endless dramas, creating the illusion of closeness and trust. But notice what's missing: genuine curiosity about your inner world, authentic support for your growth, or reciprocal emotional investment. Instead, every conversation becomes about them. Every crisis requires your immediate attention. Every emotional need demands your energy. You find yourself constantly in crisis management mode, always responding to their latest emergency, while your own psychological needs remain unmet. Jung emphasized that healthy relationships require intimacy with distance, maintaining closeness, while preserving individual psychological integrity. Psychological vampires systematically violate this principle, creating what Jung called fusion, the submersion of two individualities into one, variously called symbiosis, identification, participation, mystique. The psychological damage is profound. Jung observed that you love somebody, you identify with them, and of course, you prevail against the objects of your love and repress them by your very self-evident identity. You handle them as if they were yourself. This represents a violation of the individuality of those people, and it is a sin against your own individuality. But psychological vampires reverse even this dynamic. Instead of overwhelming you with their identity, they consume yours. They feed on your emotional responsiveness, your caretaking instincts, your capacity for empathy, while offering nothing of genuine substance in return. The warning signs are subtle but consistent. First, you feel drained after spending time with them, even when nothing particularly difficult happened. Second, conversations are consistently one-sided, always focused on their needs, problems, or dramas. Third, they have an uncanny ability to create crisis or emergency whenever you try to establish boundaries or focus on your own life. Fourth, they operate through emotional manipulation, using guilt, fear, or obligation to ensure your continued availability. They might say things like, "I don't know what I'd do without you," or "You're the only person who really understands me," to create psychological hooks that keep you engaged. Jung understood that we must maintain what he called our psychological virginity, the untouched core of authentic selfhood that remains inviolate regardless of external relationships. Psychological vampires specifically target this sacred inner space, seeking to colonize your psyche for their own emotional sustenance. Type 4. The anonymous possessor. Jung's anima and animus theory reveals another category of psychologically harmful individuals, those possessed by their unconscious contrasexual complexes, who create toxic relationships through destructive projections. The unintegrated animus is destructive to both the individual and to others around them. Here, the animus can wreak havoc since it injects itself in relationships, often making relatedness difficult or impossible. Jung himself noted that when the anima is strongly constellated, she softens the man's character and makes him touchy, irritable, moody, jealous, vain, and unadjusted. Let's break this down into practical terms. Anima-possessed men become what Jung would describe as spineless wimps, who do not know when or how to take action in the world. Yet they totally overreact to slights and confrontations. They exhibit extreme emotional volatility and inappropriate responses, either paralyzed by inaction or jumping into destructive behavior. These men often appear sensitive and emotionally available initially, which can be very attractive. But their emotional responses are actually driven by an unconscious feminine complex rather than genuine feeling. They become moody, unpredictable, and passive-aggressive. They might cry at inappropriate moments, become jealous over imagined threats, or withdraw into sullen silence when faced with normal life challenges. Animus-possessed women display a different but equally destructive pattern. Know-I-tall behavior, bullying, sadism, and controlling dynamics. Jung described the destructive animus as obstinate, harping on principles, laying down the law, dogmatic, world-reforming, theoretic, word-mongering, argumentative, and domineering. These women often appear strong and independent initially, which can also be attractive. But their strength is actually driven by an unconscious masculine complex rather than genuine personal power. They become argumentative for its own sake, constantly correcting others, insisting on being right about everything, and attempting to control through intellectual or moral superiority. The deeper danger lies in what Jung called projective relationships, where individuals fall in love with the image that he or she has projected onto the other person. Jung warned that it is only when the mirage of the projection is broken up that they will realize how they have been duped. These relationships create what Jungians call the search for the magical other, expecting someone to make our lives work, a soulmate who will repair the ravages of our personal history. This creates compulsions and toxicity because you expect the other person to give you a sense of purpose, meaning, and spiritual connection. You expect the other person to be a divine entity, and when they don't correspond, because no human being can, chaos ensues. But anima-monimous possessors are particularly dangerous because they can't distinguish between their projections and reality. The anima-possessed man projects his idealized feminine onto women, then becomes angry or disappointed when real women don't match his fantasy. The animus-possessed woman projects her idealized masculine onto men, then becomes critical or controlling when real men don't live up to her expectations. What makes this so toxic is the emotional intensity involved. Because these projections carry archetypal energy, the relationships feel fated, profound, spiritually significant. But they're actually based on unconscious complexes rather than genuine recognition of the other person as they truly are. If you find yourself in relationship with someone who seems to love an idealized version of you rather than your authentic self, or who becomes irrationally angry when you don't conform to their projection, you may be dealing with anima-monimous possession. Similarly, if you notice someone who can't seem to relate to people of the opposite gender without extreme idealization followed by bitter disappointment, or who displays the emotional volatility or intellectual domination patterns described above, you're likely encountering someone possessed by their unconscious contrasexual complex. Jung's wisdom here is crucial. These individuals need to do their own inner work to integrate their anima or animus, rather than living it out through projective relationships. Until that happens, they remain psychologically dangerous to anyone who gets caught in their projection field. Type 5. The inflated narcissist. Jung's understanding of narcissistic pathology centers on what he called psychological inflation and over-identification with the persona or false self. Narcissists live in a false persona, a fantasy of their superiority and specialness, constructed in their early years, and all their energies are taken up with maintaining that persona. Jung defined the persona as that which in reality one is not, but which oneself as well as others think one is. He warned that the danger is that they become identical with their personas. Then the damage is done. Henceforth, he lives exclusively against the background of his own biography. These individuals embody what Jung called the negative aspects of the ruler archetype, in that they desire power and control, see themselves as fit and entitled to rule, and see others as inferior subjects. They exhibit an inflated consciousness that is always egocentric and conscious of nothing but its own existence. Jung's description of psychological inflation is particularly revealing. It is incapable of learning from the past, incapable of understanding contemporary events, and incapable of drawing right conclusions about the future. It is hypnotized by itself and therefore cannot be argued with. It inevitably dooms itself to calamities that must strike it dead. But here's what makes inflated narcissists so dangerous to others. They refuse to look at the negative aspects of their shadow selves, choosing to project those repressed parts of themselves onto others. In this way, they idealize themselves and devalue others. They operate through systematic psychological manipulation, using projection as a tool to maintain their inflated self-image, while making others carry their disowned darkness. Jung understood this as fundamentally dangerous because in the narcissist, the false self usurps the role of the ego. So narcissists don't have an ego, don't have a functional ego. This creates what he called vertical splitting, the side-by-side continuous existence of otherwise incompatible psychological attitudes in depth. What this means practically is that inflated narcissists can present as charming, confident, successful, even inspiring. They often have genuine talents or achievements that support their inflated self-image. But underneath this grandiose presentation lies a psychological structure that cannot tolerate any threat to their inflated persona. They become dangerous when you represent any challenge to their self-image. This might happen if you achieve something they wanted, if you see through their performance, if you fail to provide the admiration they require, or if you simply exist as a separate person with your own needs and perspectives. Their response to narcissistic injury is often swift and devastating. They might engage in character assassination, attempting to destroy your reputation or relationships. They might use intimate knowledge gained during vulnerable moments to hurt you. They might employ sophisticated psychological manipulation to make you question your own perceptions and memories. Jung emphasized that the inflated individual has lost contact with their own shadow and with external reality. They live in a fantasy world where they are superior and others exist primarily to support their grandiose self-image. This makes genuine relationship impossible, because they cannot see you as a separate person with inherent worth and dignity. The warning signs include an inability to handle criticism or perceived slights, a tendency to exploit others for personal gain without remorse, a pattern of idealizing people who serve their needs while devaluing those who don't, and an underlying rage that emerges when their inflated self-image is threatened. Perhaps most importantly, Jung understood that inflated narcissists are fundamentally unconscious. They have identified so completely with their persona that they have lost access to their authentic self. This makes them unpredictable and potentially dangerous, because they operate from unconscious complexes rather than conscious choice. Type 6. The collective shadow carrier. Jung's most sophisticated insight concerned individuals who manipulate through collective shadow dynamics. These are people who exploit societal unconsciousness for personal power. Jung warned that if psychological projection at a collective level became too widespread, war would be the likely outcome. These manipulative personalities understand how to exploit what Jung called the participation mystique of groups. Jung suggests that a society that focuses on their persona is more likely to be susceptible to the rise of a dictator, as they gain support by prodding points and watching a crowd's reactions, and then follow up on areas that receive favorable feedback. Jung observed that when we cast a group of people in this negative light, seeing them as the primary source of all that ails a society, it becomes possible to justify persecution, violence, and perhaps even extermination of the group in question. Collective shadow carriers systematically exploit these projections for personal gain. The mechanism involves what Jung called archetypal possession, where individuals become inflated by collective contents and lose their human limitations. They present themselves as carrying divine or absolute authority, making them extremely dangerous to both individuals and society. These people are skilled at identifying societal fears, anxieties, and prejudices, then positioning themselves as the solution to these collective problems. They promise to eliminate the bad people, the dangerous groups, the corrupting influences that threaten the collective sense of purity or safety. But here's what makes them so insidious on a personal level. They often begin by seeming to understand your legitimate concerns or frustrations. They validate your sense that something is wrong in your life or society. They offer simple explanations for complex problems and present themselves as uniquely qualified to provide solutions. Over time, they gradually introduce more extreme ideas, testing your boundaries and normalizing increasingly toxic perspectives. They create in-group versus out-group dynamics, making you feel special for understanding their truth, while everyone else remains blind or corrupted. They exploit your desire to belong, your need for meaning, your frustration with genuine problems in your life or society. But their ultimate goal is not to solve these problems, but to use your psychological energy and social influence for their own purposes. Jung emphasized that modern people are ignorant of what they really are. We have simply forgotten what a human being really is. We have to discover our shadow. Otherwise, we are driven into a world war in order to see what beasts we are. Collective shadow carriers exploit this widespread psychological ignorance. They understand that people who haven't done their own shadow work are vulnerable to projection and manipulation. They position themselves as carriers of light while making others carry the darkness. The personal danger lies in how these dynamics can completely corrupt your capacity for independent thought and ethical judgment. When you become caught in collective shadow projection, you lose access to your own moral compass and begin justifying actions or beliefs that would normally horrify you. The warning signs include black and white thinking about complex social issues, an increasing sense of urgency about eliminating certain groups or ideas, a growing intolerance for anyone who questions their perspective, and a willingness to sacrifice personal relationships for ideological purity. Jung understood that this type of manipulation represents perhaps the greatest threat to both individual consciousness and collective sanity. When people become possessed by collective shadow projections, they lose their capacity for individual moral judgment and become capable of genuine evil, while believing themselves to be serving good. Psychological protection and Jung's wisdom. Now that we've explored these 6 dangerous personality types, the crucial question becomes, how do we protect ourselves? Jung's approach to protection emphasizes internal development rather than external strategies alone. His fundamental insight was that knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people. The primary protective mechanism involves shadow integration and projection withdrawal. Jung emphasized that the best political, social, and spiritual work we can do is to withdraw the projection of our own shadow onto others. He explained that if you imagine someone who is brave enough to withdraw all his projections, then you get an individual who is conscious of a pretty thick shadow. This might seem counterintuitive. How does becoming aware of our own capacity for manipulation, projection, or harm protect us from others who exhibit these patterns? Jung's insight was profound. When we're unconscious of our own shadow, we become vulnerable to those who exploit these unconscious elements. For example, if you've never acknowledged your own capacity for selfishness, you might be drawn to people who appear completely selfless, not recognizing the manipulation underneath their apparent generosity. If you haven't integrated your own need for power and control, you might be attracted to people who appear strong and decisive, not seeing the narcissistic inflation behind their confidence. Jung's practical guidance focuses on developing what he called psychological boundaries and maintaining one's temanos, or sacred psychological space. This act of discrimination yields practical results only if it succeeds in fixing reasonable boundaries to the ego. But boundary setting isn't just about saying no to others. It's about developing a clear sense of where you end and others begin psychologically. It's about maintaining your capacity for independent thought, feeling, and choice, even in the face of pressure to merge, conform, or sacrifice your authenticity. The ultimate protection comes through what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole and authentic. Jung understood that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. This conscious engagement with our own shadow provides the strongest defense against manipulation. Here's why individuation is so protective. When you know your own psychological patterns, triggers, and vulnerabilities, you're less likely to be blindsided by others who might exploit them. When you've developed genuine self-worth based on authentic self-knowledge rather than external validation, you're less susceptible to manipulative flattery or criticism. When you've learned to tolerate your own complexity and contradiction, you're less likely to be drawn to people who offer simple answers or demand black and white thinking. When you've developed your capacity for solitude and inner reflection, you're less dependent on others for your sense of identity or worth. Jung's final wisdom on avoiding toxic personalities was profound. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. The development of consciousness, particularly consciousness of our own psychological dynamics, represents our greatest protection against those who would exploit our unconscious vulnerabilities. This doesn't mean becoming paranoid or isolated. It means developing the psychological sophistication to recognize unhealthy patterns, while maintaining your openness to genuine connection and growth. Jung understood that such a man knows that whatever is wrong in the world is in himself. And if he only learns to deal with his own shadow, he has done something real for the world. The individuation process, becoming conscious of our own projections, integrating our shadow, and developing authentic selfhood naturally protects us from manipulation while contributing to collective psychological health. Conclusion: the path of conscious relationship. As we reach the end of this exploration, Jung's most important insight becomes clear. The meeting with oneself is, at first, the meeting with one's own shadow. This courageous inner work becomes both our protection from toxic others and our contribution to a more conscious world. Jung concluded that the sad truth is that man's real life consists of a complex of inexorable opposites, day and night, birth and death, happiness and misery, good and evil. Embracing this complexity through conscious psychological development represents both our protection from toxic others and our contribution to a more conscious world. The 6 personality types we've explored: the shadow projector, the individuation blocker, the psychological vampire, the anonymous possessor, the inflated narcissist, and the collective shadow carrier, all represent different ways that unconsciousness manifests in human relationships. But Jung's ultimate message isn't one of fear or avoidance. It's one of consciousness and empowerment. When we do our own psychological work, when we integrate our shadow, when we develop authentic selfhood through individuation, we naturally become less vulnerable to manipulation, while more capable of genuine love and connection. The path forward isn't about building walls against others, but about building consciousness within ourselves. It's about developing the psychological sophistication to recognize unhealthy patterns while maintaining our capacity for authentic relationship. Remember Jung's warning and his promise. Those who remain unconscious will have their lives directed by unconscious forces they call fate. But those who do the brave work of making the unconscious conscious gain the power to choose their relationships consciously, to love from strength rather than neediness, and to contribute to the healing of our collective human shadow. This is Jung's gift to us: the understanding that our greatest protection and our greatest contribution lies not in avoiding the darkness in others, but in making conscious the darkness within ourselves. In doing so, we become both psychologically sovereign and genuinely available for the kind of relationships that support growth, consciousness, and authentic human connection. The choice, as always, is ours.